Welcome back. Depending on the theological traditions and the history of different Christian denominations, their degree of isolation from the society round about them can vary. There are some very closed groups. We think of, for example, Old Order Amish or Mennonite communities that live in significant isolation from the communities round about them. And then there are other traditions like that of the United Church of Canada, where it has always been deeply embedded within the larger Canadian society. We have not been an isolationist group, and for much of our history, the emphasis has been on the close connection between good citizenship and good Christian behavior. And so that has both positive and negatives in our history. For one thing, for much of our history, the opinions of our members had been fairly consistent with those of folk who looked and lived like them in the society around about them. And that usually meant the dominant white patriarchal structure of society. Now, there are times when those general social attitudes have been resisted by official church pronouncements, and sometimes they've been reinforced. So, on the one hand, we would be justified in saying that the responses to experience of exclusion and oppression by many different groups of people were pretty feeble. We generally have not done a very good job. On the other hand, those very tentative steps that have been taken can be seen as examples of working towards greater racial justice, however small and inadequate the individual steps might have been. So it's quite justified to say it's not enough. On the other hand, it's also justified to say it's out of step with the levels of uh, ignorance and intolerance in the society roundabout. So it's a mixed thing. The 43rd General Council of the United Church of Canada, meeting in Oshawa, Ontario, closed on a very powerful note. One of the intercultural observers, the Reverend Paul Walful, reflected back to the rest of us as commissioners the experience of being a black minister in a predominantly white church. His verbal reflection is on your list for this week, and I invite you to stop, and if you haven't listened to it, please do so before hearing the rest of this lecture. My question to you is, what was your reaction to Paul's statement? How did it make you feel? Could you identify with, or perhaps identify, the examples that he was giving? If you're part of a community of faith, how do you think people in your congregation would respond? Is this a video clip that you could share with them? Why or why not? I was a commissioner at that general council, and I still remember the impact. It was as if Paul's testimony opened up a floodgate of ethnic and racialized accounts. And even here, I recognize that I'm stumbling because, from my perspective anyway, the language is still very fluid. At the denominational level, we have an ethnic ministries council. And many people refer to those who are visibly not from the dominant culture or visibly not Anglo-Saxon Northern European as racialized. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, but that may be something that you'll want to raise for discussion in your postings or in our class conversation. The many accounts given at General Council that were brought forth by Paul's reflection to us, they were powerful and moving. They were stories of racist behavior on both a large and a small scale, but they were obviously significant to the speaker. And I think this may be the next great task for the United Church of Canada to extend our efforts at reconciliation beyond First Nations to other non numerically dominant groups in our society to truly be an interracial, intercultural church. Of course, the topic of prejudice and racism is as old as Canada and older, and it's as young as yesterday's headlines. The racial profiling of darker skinned immigrants, assaults on hijab wearing women, attacks on mosques and synagogues, the politicization of immigration and inclusion as hot button issues for some voters. And what does it mean for Canada to be a multicultural society? Are we genuinely prepared to welcome refugees? And is it just some refugees? Of course, the events south of our border and the government offensive against those who are immigrants and refugees raise that question to an even higher degree of awareness. We have to continue to separate Canada from the United States. Examining the historical record allows us to appreciate the enormity of the situation in our own country. It also encourages us to embrace solutions because if our goal is to address covert as well as overt forms of racism, we have to know what has been happening. Some observers suggest that because racism in Canada is less overt and aggressive, say, than for example, Britain or the United States, it's even harder to address. It's no less real, but because it's less overt and less aggressive, it's harder to address. Of course, language is important. The term prejudice refers to negative attitudes directed to an entire category of people. Now, of course, this is by no means always based on race or skin color. There's lots of non-race-based prejudice out there. But in this particular conversation, our focus is on race. So it's possible for individuals within groups who are considered racialized to also be prejudiced. For instance, we may read of people being insulted or called out for not being black enough or not Asian enough. The charge was leveled at American presidential candidate Kamala Harris. She was said by some to be not black enough. Similar opinions and expressions exist in every community, so prejudice is expressed and experienced on a potentially universal level. Racism, strictly speaking, is the belief that certain groups or races are innately superior to others, and it is coupled with the power to enforce the subordination, marginalization, and mistreatment of those groups. Prejudice is an attitude, racism is a system. And this is important to remember in our society, which so often focuses on the individual. It's entirely possible that someone who would never engage in overtly racist talk or action, they benefit from living in a racist society. So racism in society and church impacts us all. We explore some of that reality in the white privilege units of the United Church Formation Program. The significance of racism, strictly speaking, is that one group has the power to change the systemic situation, and the other group does not. For example, in what was to become Canada, when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834 and black men became citizens, they had the legal right to vote. However, the exercise of that right was often disrupted both by white mobs and by local legislation that restricted voting rights to those who owned property or who had a taxable net worth. So many blacks, along with many poor and working class whites, were disenfranchised. Although technically they had the franchise, they were disenfranchised in practice, and the only people who could change the situation were those who could vote. In other words, wealthier white men. That's a racist system because though one group has the power to change it and the other group does not. Continuing on with the example, black women, despite the ending of slavery in the British Empire in 1834, black women, along with all other women, were denied voting rights federally until 1918 and longer in some provinces. And again, they were in a situation where they did not have the legal power to change the situation. So, racism as a system not only includes negative attitudes towards a group of people, but also the power to enforce that attitude. Thus, by definition, a term like reversed racism is meaningless if the minority group lacks the power to enforce. Prejudice, however, can be felt and expressed by any group in any direction. Thus, we see that the arrival of Europeans and their interaction with First Nations people is a story both of prejudice and of racism. It's estimated that before 1500 there were some 500 First Nations with 58 languages and well developed social institutions on Turtle Island. The assumptions of white superiority over the so called savages gave license for appalling acts of depredation. We'll speak later in the course about the Indian residential institutions, but they are part of a whole theme and chapter in the effort to, quote, assimilate, civilize, and Christianize, end of quotation, Aboriginal people, and so absorb them into the white culture. But even when absorbed, they were not really welcome. The racism continues. The current status of Canada's First Nation reflects both the results of 400 years of cultural domination, exploitation, and subjugation, with only comparatively brief efforts to reverse the process, as well as illustrating that racism and prejudice can impact different individuals and different groups in very different fashions. The immigration of black people to Canada is a multivariate story. Black immigrants of African descent are noted in Canadian history from the early 1600s. Matthew de Costa, pictured here, was a translator for Samuel de Champlain, and the fact that he was able to be a translator with indigenous peoples suggests that he had been in North America much longer than we really know. Some of those who came to what would become Canada were slaves. Others were skilled free persons. Even later, after the American Revolution, there were United Empire Loyalists who fled the new United States. The difference in treatment of black and white loyalists gives us a glimpse of racism in action. White loyalists who came to British North America were each given a 40-acre land grant, while black loyalists were settled on a scrubland at the edge of white townships and communities. Nor were they given outright ownership of the land, the excuse being that they were simple and could be taken advantage of by unscrupulous characters. So, for instance, in the 1880s, a church-based community of blacks was established in Africville on land given by Queen Victoria. Later, in the 1960s, the land was expropriated and the houses razed to make room for a bridge across the Halifax Harbor. And although apologies have been issued, struggles continue today to secure appropriate compensation for the displaced residents and their descendants. In southern Ontario, significant numbers of blacks arrived through immigration and later via the Underground Railway. It may have been in response to these growing numbers the Ontario Common Schools Act was passed in 1850. It legalized segregated schools, and that law was not repealed until 1964. Black enlistment and service in both World Wars was restricted, and the black battalions that were formed had white officers. It was not until the Fair Accommodation Practices Acts in 1954 that hotels, restaurants, recreational clubs, and movie theaters were officially desegregated. So in the 1930s, the Reverend Wilbur Howard, who was later to become a moderator of the United Church of Canada, but at that point was a national staff person for youth ministry, was refused accommodation in a hotel in Essex, Ontario, because of his race. Now, in the latter decades of the 20th century, we see significant waves of black immigration from the Caribbean. And those folk carry their own stories of exploitation that are different in significant elements from the experience of black North Americans. And so we see this historic segregation being played out in churches. In many parts of the country, we find black churches and black denominations of long standing, usually or often because they were refused any sort of standing within the dominant white church. The Union Church was formed in Montreal in the 1920s, and it continues as a strong black presence in the United Church of Canada today. In the Maritimes, most blacks who identify as Christians are Baptist and Pentecostal in practice. Ezekiel Hart was the first Jew to be elected to a Canadian legislature. In 1807, he was elected in Trois-Rivières, but he was actually barred from taking his seat. He was barred again when he was re-elected in 1808, all because of anti-Semitism. It was 1837 before an Act of Parliament was passed conferring full rights to Jews, at least in theory. However, both racism and prejudice continued, with a systematic refusal to employ Jews in large organizations such as banks and police forces well into the 1930s, and barred from elite social clubs, beaches, and holiday resorts in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. Universities also set limits on Jewish enrollment. And our efforts to push back against that were few and far between. Canada was pervasively anti-Semitic, and the churches did little to contest that or combat that. Anti-Semitism, for example, was reflected in the treatment of Jews fleeing Europe prior to World War II. A Canadian official asked by journalists how many Jewish refugees would be admitted famously replied, quote, "None is too many," end of quote. With such an outlook, it probably is no surprise that Canada had the worst record of any Western country in providing refuge to Jews fleeing Hitler's Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s. And finally, in 1947, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King pledged to remove objectionable discrimination from Canada's Immigration Act. Nonetheless, Canada continued to practice selective restriction, favoring immigration candidates who were British, Irish, French, or American. When we look at the treatment of Asians, we have several different groups of people to consider, and they have both unique and shared experience. Chinese immigrants were recruited as cheap labor for the building of the National Railroad. About 15,000 Chinese workers were brought to Canada, and they suffered significant casualties as they were given more dangerous assignments and significantly lower wages. And when the railroad was finished and their usefulness to that project was at an end, the survivors were then treated as unwelcome guests. In 1885, a head tax was placed on every Chinese wanting to enter Canada. It was originally set at $50. It was later raised to $100 in 1900 and to $500 in 1903, a truly astronomical sum. There was the fear of the so-called yellow peril, evident in John A. Macdonald's words, quote, "A Mongolian or Chinese population in our country would not be a wholesome element," end of quotation. In 1923, Chinese were completely barred from entering Canada, and those already here were not allowed to sponsor family members, the only Asian group singled out in that way. This was not repealed until 1940, the same year that Chinese Canadians were first allowed to vote, and finally allowed admittance in small numbers to professions such as law and pharmacy and accounting. More recently, increased immigration from Taiwan, Hong Kong, other Southeast Asian countries have sparked anti-Chinese sentiments around housing, business malls taking up university spaces, and so on. The identification by public figures of COVID-19 as a disease of Chinese origin increased that prejudice. And that's not helped by the current geopolitical, geofinancial issues between Canada and China, at least in part prompted by the tariff regime of the American government. And so that relationship continues to be one of challenge. But again, to say that in most measures, the United Church was fairly representative of the society round about us. In other occasions, though, pushed back against this. And we do have Chinese United Church congregations, usually growing out of the experience of Chinese folk in mainland China with the various Canadian missions that were very active there, about which we will speak in a subsequent class. Like the Chinese, early immigrants from Japan contributed much to the development of Canada. This was primarily in British Columbia through the fishing and fruit and vegetable industries. The fact that they were model citizens did not spare them from racist oppression. For instance, in 1907, the Japanese section of the city of Vancouver was caught up in the anti-Oriental riots, although those were particularly directed at Chinese immigrants. In 1942, over 22,000 Japanese descended Like the Chinese, early immigrants from Japan contributed much to the development of Canada, primarily in British Columbia, through fishing and fruit and vegetable industries. They were model citizens, but that did not stop them from being oppressed racially. For instance, although the riots were actually directed at the Chinese community, the Japanese section of Vancouver was caught up in the anti-Oriental riots of 1907. And then in 1942, over 20, Like the Chinese, early immigrants from Japan contributed much to the development of Canada. This was primarily in British Columbia through fishing and fruit and vegetable industries. They were model citizens, although that did not spare them from racist oppression. For example, the Japanese section of Vancouver was caught up in the anti Oriental riots of 1907, despite the fact that those were primarily focused on Chinese immigrants. And then in 1942, when war with Japan broke out, over 22,000 individuals, Japanese born, naturalized Canadians, Japanese descendants born in Canada, and foreigners, were declared to be enemy aliens. They were stripped of their rights. Their homes, their properties, their businesses were confiscated or auctioned off at rock bottom prices, and whole families were removed to internment camps in mining ghost towns in the interior of British Columbia, or to sugar beet farms in Alberta, or to work on road construction. Most were not allowed to return to their coastal communities following the war, but they were forced to relocate to communities in the Rockies. Some were even compelled to return to Japan, even though they might have been Canadian born. And we'll say more about this chapter when we turn to the United Church's response to war. Now, the Multiculturalism Act of 1988 led to an acknowledgement of wrong and an apology and compensation of $21,000 per survivor by the Canadian government, which represented a moral victory, if far from adequate compensation for what was actually lost. Indians from South Asia, particularly Sikhs, were recruited to work in the forests of Western Canada. Following the liberalization of the Immigration Act in 1967, more Indians from different parts of the subcontinent have settled in other parts of Canada and entered a variety of occupations and professions. And so, to summarize all of this, from the 1870s onward, the Canadian government, supported by most of the population, including most of the dominant mainline churches, attempted to maintain a white country, conveniently ignoring the indigenous population, of course. And it's in spite of, not because of the predominant attitude, within the United Church, so-called ethnic congregations were formed in many parts of the country and have a long history of loyalty to the denomination. It's only in the 1950s, under pressure from the rest of the British Commonwealth, that those immigration restrictive laws were gradually relaxed. And even after the laws were relaxed, European immigrants, folk who were Caucasian, were still highly favored. As we know, the number and sort of immigrants is often a topic for intense debate. It becomes a political flashpoint. And in more recent years, large numbers of Muslim immigrants have led to religion and culture becoming flashpoints in many communities. And so this story of ethnic and racialized communities within the United Church is not necessarily a very positive one, but it is a reflection of the degree to which the church, although claiming to be different, was very much moved in the way of the society rather than pushing the society in another direction, with a very few exceptions.